All right, everybody. So for your penultimate lesson in finishing off a rendering, we're going to start to look at how you sort of filter it and apply materials over top of it. So there are a couple of things we have to discuss. I'm going to start, I think, with lighting and sort of like setting some mood items. Lighting is really critical to kind of capture, and the reason I say that is because the lighting in photography really changes how material renders in a two-dimensional platform. So for instance, if you have, how many of you guys really are a fan of J.J. Abrams, the director? No? Yeah. Okay, cool. So you know J.J. Abrams loves his lens flares, right? So do you know what a lens flare is? Okay. Does anybody know what a lens flare is? All right, time to go to the infamous Google. Lens flare. So basically, lens flare are these things. They happen when a lens gets dirty, and then the light is actually refracting around elements that are obstructing the rays of light going into the lens, or something like that. So a lens flare can actually be used very creatively in rendering settings, but they're usually very intense. The only times you're going to actually get a lens flare is when the source of light is in your render. And that's not the case for me. There is no sun in the scene, so I can't really use a lens flare. So what happens when, and let me actually, let's look at it in Star Wars. Perfect examples of lens flares in Star Wars, right? So basically it's like when there is light in the, or when there's a source of light in the scene and the dirtiness of the lens or the smudginess of the lens is actually casting that light out. So anyway, we're not going to be doing that in my scene, but you may have your sun source is maybe in your scene, or if you have a really powerful light family, and that is something that you want to accentuate, you can add a small lens flare to those. So let's go back to this and let's start to look at what happens when you have a more dramatic effect in what you're doing with your lensing, so to speak, or your filtering when the light is not in your scene. So it's actually called a light leak. So a light leak looks a little bit more like this, and it can happen a number of different ways. It can happen when your camera is moving, when the source of light is moving and outside of the frame, or if your lens is dirty and the source of light is outside of the frame and it's kind of casting, weird aurora type light residue, I guess, or like residual light. So what we're going to look at is how we can use this to accentuate our render. And you can actually use it with very simple filtering. Let's start with something that's sort of in between a light leak and a lens flare, because my sun is kind of close to my my scene, sort of ish. So I'm going to use something like this. Let's copy. Well, actually, let me see if there's one that's a little better that has actual black in it. All right, maybe it's not really a great one. Okay, we'll use something like this. Actually, I changed my mind. I don't like that. Let's go back to lens flares. Looking for like a soft lens flare. Something in the corner. All right, well, we could work with this, okay? So basically, sorry, I keep changing my mind because I'm trying to find something that has like an effect that I want. Let's go with this one. Okay, so this one has black in it and it has like some pretty intense sun leaking in from the top right. So I'm going to copy and paste this into Photoshop and just lay this thing right on top of everything you're doing. And that means everything, even all the entourage and stuff that you have in your scene. So let's put this, we'll dock it sort of just a hair off the corner, and we're going to pull it so that it's higher or larger than the actual scene. We'll kind of yank that back a little bit so the intensity of that item isn't, of that source isn't totally flooding into my camera lens. Okay, so what do we do with this? The blackness that you see here is very important because when we use our filter settings for that layer, what is black and what is not black is going to be used to define whether or not the effect is being sort of wiped away. Similar to the way the layer mask works, these are going to be effect masks or lighting masks that sit over top. So what we're going to do is I think we're going to use screen. Yes, let's use screen. So this little menu here has a bunch of different types of sort of filtering settings, and they all do slightly different things. I honestly couldn't tell you the dictionary definition of each one of them, but yeah, anyway, it's just an interesting thing to know about. So you can use, you know, darken, which we don't use that much. Color burn is for like very subtle, I think, things that you're going to change your opacity for. And oftentimes these get balanced with opacity as well. That wasn't going to do anything for me on multiply. Lighten can kind of change like and accentuate with color certain things if you wanted to do that, but black is going to disappear. But screen is actually going to kind of soften, you know, the color that we're using. So if it's like an orange or a blue, it'll soften it up. So most of the time when I'm doing this, I use screen. So already you can tell that there's a significant difference between the original, which looks kind of flat, and the new one, which actually has kind of a lot of action going on. It gives it that sort of whimsical feeling that I think is kind of important. So the other thing we can do is double up on a couple of other types. So something like this, if it's going to have an intense light source in the top right, it might actually have a rather you know, soft or subtle effect on one of the other sides. So I'm going to try and pull something that has kind of like a softness on the other side of the camera here. I'm trying to look for something in the bottom left corner, or any corner for that matter. Maybe something like this. Copy that. Drop this in. So I just want this to be like really subtle. So something happening on the other side of the image. And I'm going to put this one on, let's do color dodge, but let's pull the opacity down pretty low. No, I don't want color dodge. Let's do, not burn. Vivid light. Yeah, all right, so I'm going to stick with vivid light, and I'm going to pull the opacity up a little bit. And I think I'm actually going to darken it up. So I'm going to grab my paintbrush, and I'm going to get like a really big soft paintbrush, and I'm going to paint some black around kind of the area that I don't really want it to affect as much. So that's going to soften that up a bit too. Let's put this one under this. There we go. So that brightens up the top one, and then it leaves that little leak on the side there too. The opacity of these things really is critical. So I just wanted it to be like a tiny, tiny little hint that breaks up what's happening on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, on the projector, you can't even really see it that well. But anytime you're doing this kind of stuff, turning something off and turning it back on again can really help. So I think this opacity needs to come down too. That kind of darkened it up a bit too much. Let's try overlay. Yeah, overlay could work. Yeah, okay. I like overlay a little better. So what overlay did there, if you couldn't tell, it actually kept some of the saturation because the old one was kind of tearing some of that saturation away by giving it too many different layers and effects. But this one kind of added that saturation back in, and I actually like it a bit better. So anyway, it's not an exact science. You kind of have to fool around with it a little bit to get to the effect that you want. But then once you balance it, it actually creates kind of a nice little subtle scene. What questions do you have on that before I move into overlays for like textural qualities and stuff like that? Nothing? Okay.